Yes, I'm working in Sweden at the moment, but for the ones who don't know, I'm Portuguese. I studied at Lisbon University many years ago. And since my studies in Lisbon, I have been living mostly in the Netherlands and now in Sweden, but still very much Portuguese. But that's just an aside. Let's talk indeed about responsible artificial intelligence. What is it? What is it not? And how can we move from nice words about how responsible, ethical, and trustworthy we need to be to concrete ways and ways to operationalize and to ensure that the way that we develop and use these intelligent systems is indeed responsible and aiming at trust and human well-being. So the question to start is, of course, what is AI? And it might be a strange question, and especially in a more technical environment, you probably are laughing now about the question. But if we go into a more policy-oriented, or to the public in general, or to the media, we start seeing that AI is currently being used to mean everything and anything, or maybe to mean nothing at all. So between the idea that AI is just business as usual, is the next step in digitization, is just what everybody is doing, to the idea that AI is some kind of magic, and the magic narrative comes in different ways, from the way of it is a kind of systems that seemingly is very useful and is able to predict and to say all kinds of wise things, but we don't really understand how it happens. So it's magic in the ways that it works, to being magic in the sense that it might someday, somehow, we don't really understand how, become more intelligent than we are and really take over the world and so on. So there are lots of narratives going in that direction. Fortunately, most of those ones are in the science fiction or in Hollywood. But the idea of that, what exactly do we talk about when we talk about AI, is getting increasingly diffuse and fuzzy. AI is software, definitely. It's about the systems that we develop using computational means to somehow exhibit or replicate characteristics that we would describe as intelligent in people. It's about systems that can act more or less autonomously or automatically, take decisions, take steps, take actions without someone indicating directly what they need to do. It's about systems that are able somehow to adapt, to sense and adapt to a certain environment in which they are inserted. And they do that in interaction with us and taking decisions or acting in ways that affect us in many different ways. But AI is not just about algorithms. Yes, we use algorithms to build AI systems. We use algorithms to build any computer system. And we use algorithms to do all kinds of stuff in our daily lives. Every time you bake a cake, you are using an algorithm, the recipe of the cake, the instructions to move towards a certain result is the definition of an algorithm. So we use algorithms in many different ways. And if we go back to this example of the cake, the end result of the cake that you bake following that algorithm is not only dependent on the recipe that you follow, it's dependent on your qualities and the qualities of those that are going to bake the cake, or the decisions that you take about who is going to build this cake, how am I going to get this cake, but also about decisions in terms of what are the ingredients that I'm going to put in this cake. I'm going to use margarine, or I'm going to use biological boiled butter. Am I going to use the cheapest apples that I can find, or the cheapest eggs that I can find, or I'm going to use free-range eggs? All these decisions influence and determine, as much as the algorithm, as much as the recipe, the end result. AI is also not just about machine learning. Machine learning is one specific class of algorithms within the AI scientific field, but there are many other types of types of techniques and methods around. AI is not just also not about statistics or data analytics. Yes, in AI and in many of the data-driven approach to AI, we use statistics and we use data analytics, but not all statistics or all data analytics are necessarily also AI. And if we look around, and especially, like I say, from the business or the policy perspective, this is not always well understood. What is from the perspective of responsibility in AI, from the perspective of the impact of AI, what is really important to don't forget is that AI is not existing in a vacuum. AI applications are not alone. AI is always part of a socio-technical ecosystem consisting of those that develop, those that provide, those that use, those that legislate, those that organize, those that manage. All of these institutions, all of these people are part of the AI ecosystem. Actually, there is a saying by Kate Crawford recently that AI is neither intelligent nor it is artificial. And it is not artificial because a lot of the work done about developing, but also about the collection of the data, the management of the data, and so on, it's all done by people. So it's not artificial. And it's also not intelligence. AI can do well pattern identification and does that increasingly well. It can extrapolate those patterns to new data and can take actions based on those patterns. But what AI systems for a very large part are not at all able to do is understand what those patterns are about. It doesn't understand the context. It doesn't understand the meaning of the patterns. It doesn't understand if it can identify ducks in pictures or trucks in pictures or cancer cells in scans, but it has no idea of what a duck is, what a car is, or a cancer cell. It also has no idea whether a car and what are the difference or the similarities between cars and cancer cells. It has really no idea of what it's looking about. And because of that, is extremely easy and extremely being done to trick AI in one way or another to do the wrong thing. So the adversarial AI methods are increasingly used, and you just have to Google a bit around, and you will see many examples in which just with some tweak in the picture or some tweak in the real life, like in this case of the stop sign there, it's very easy to make the AI system believe a completely different thing than what we would, even in those circumstances, usually identify as being a school bus or a stop sign. So the responsibility to using these systems, knowing that the capability of identifying patterns doesn't go along with the capability to understand what those patterns are. The responsibility to use these systems is ours. So we are the ones who decide that we are taking over the decisions of the system, even knowing that in many cases, or in most cases, the system doesn't understand what it's doing. And therefore, we really need to ourselves to understand very well the context and implications of the decisions that we take of using this type of systems. So that gets to responsible AI. The main question in responsible AI is the question of should we use AI? When should we use AI? Where should we not use AI? And then who is we that are going to decide this? Who is going to decide? Is that me as a developer? Is the policymaker? Is the society? Are we going to hold a referendum every time that we want to use or not AI? How are we going to involve the different stakeholders? How are we going to identify which values we want to build these systems for? Do we want to build these systems to optimize accuracy, to optimize profit, to optimize safety, to optimize fairness? All of those are possible, but all of those have consequences in terms of what the results of the system are. So which values are we going to consider? How are we going to prioritize those values? And how can we deal with the dilemmas, the cases in which there is not one correct solution and all possible solutions are in one way or another less desirable. So those are the questions that hold behind and above the development or the use of any AI system. And we really need to take that into account, because as we know, and as we have been increasingly seen from the media in the last few years, AI, the opportunities that applying AI and using AI systems come together with lots of risks. We can use AI for all kinds of issues, to image recognition, to use chatbots, to support decision making, all kinds of examples. But all of those come in one way or another with issues of privacy, issues of bias and fairness, issues of accountability, also issues about our future as people and the future of our jobs, the future of our environments. So all these issues we really need to be able to balance as we are developing and using AI systems. And responsible AI is not just about the ethical reasoning. It's not just about the so-called trolley problems. It's about understanding that there is not a single, simple, and unique answer to all this type of questions, all this type of issues around the use and the implications of AI. There is not a silver bullet. Even if we go back to the philosophers, taking different types of philosophical theories, it will lead to different types of considerations and therefore to different types of results. So the issue is to understand that we do have an issue here, that we have something that we really, all of us in a participatory way and in a structured and a transparent way, need to address before and above using AI systems. It's about considering what are the decisions that we want an AI system to make. Are these decisions about our plans, about our actions, or about our goals? Do we want AI systems, the self-driving car in the cartoon there, to determine where we go? Or do we want these systems to be able to help us plan the route in the most efficient way? Both are possible, both are as easy probably to determine. We have data about what we do usually, what are our goals and so on. So that is possible to be done. But the question is, what do we exactly feel comfortable? What do we trust an AI system to do or not? And again, do we want AI systems to be beneficial for us as a group, or to be beneficial for me as an individual? And we all know those decisions are not necessarily balanced. We also know that what is morally or ethically acceptable is not always what society accepts, and definitely not across time, and not always what is legally allowed. So this space and maneuvering between this space of what is allowed, what is acceptable and accepted, it's something which is not for the AI system to determine. So it's not the AI system which is going to decide what is ethical or what is legal, but it's for us to consider. At the same time, as we do need to accept and to understand that we cannot have it all. And it's impossible in most cases to put together and give equal priority to all types of values, to all types of principles. So we do need to make choices, and those choices influence, again, the way that systems are designed. Fortunately, we have been doing these choices and designing this type of systems for quite some time, not only in AI. And for instance, the way we design our democratic process have a lot to do with the way we can and should be designing our AI systems. Because in both cases, the way we design them impacts the decisions that the system can make, which then impacts our society. And again, the way our societies will impact how we will design the systems and so on. So a lot of it is about trust, and how to ensure this trust, how to develop this trust in the systems. And we not always understand the reasons or the results of the systems. Not the AI systems, but also often not of our democratic process also don't always give the expected or most logical results. And all of that has to do with what choices do we make, what choices is possible to the system to consider. how these choices are formulated, what is the information that it's available for those making the decisions, either in the democratic process or for the algorithms in the AI systems, which information is there, how much are you involved, how legitimate is the decision and the ones who are providing or organizing these decisions. And moreover, how are we aggregating many different possible opinions, and how can we aggregate all the different understandings of data in systems. So we have been working with these systems for quite some time, and we really need to understand the social aspects of an AI system, not only focusing on the technical aspects. So responsible AI is about ensuring that AI systems are aligned with legal regulations, with the law of the country, are ethical in terms of aligned with human rights, about ethical values and societal principles, but it's about also ensuring that the system is reliable, that the system does what the package says it's supposed to be doing, in somehow that it should be beneficial. And again, the question will be beneficial for who? And above all, and especially from the perspective of systems engineering, like I have, how can we verify that indeed the system is lawful and ethical and reliable and beneficial and so on? So when responsible AI, if we go back to this very basic and broad definition of what an AI system could be, taking into account that this an AI system, that this software is part of a larger social-technical ecosystem, we want this ecosystem, so the societal part together with the technical part, to ensure art. And art stands for accountability, responsibility, and transparency. So if the system is interacting with us, we need that this whole social technical ecosystem ensures that there is accountability for the decisions, for the actions of the system. It also ensures that the system is able to provide account, to provide explanations for what is happening. If the system is autonomous, if the software is autonomous, then somewhere in the social technical ecosystem, we need to put responsibility for whatever are the actions of these systems. It's not the software that it's responsible. Software is a tool, is an artifact. The responsibility is with humans or human organizations. And finally, if the system is adapting, is changing, is modifying its behavior and its possibilities as it goes, we need to have some idea of transparency about how and why is this changing. So taking responsibility, we can do it in many different ways. We can look at the process by which the systems are designed, are developed, are deployed, are used, are managed, are legislated about. We also can talk about the behavior of the systems, the idea of ethics by design, or privacy by design, or safety by design. So ensure that the behavior of the system embeds some of these principles. Or we can look finally at the responsibility for the design. So ensuring that the stakeholders are aware of their role and their position and their responsibility in the whole process. Fortunately, there is a lot happening in Europe and around the world in terms of developing principles and guidelines to ensure that AI systems are indeed developed and used in a responsible and trustworthy way. It's hardly, there are many of these type of principles and guidelines. I believe that there are like 180 at this moment from many different types of organizations, from very large ones like UNESCO or the European Union or the World Economic Forum, but also from the small organizations, associations at the national or even at the regional level. So there are many of them. I have been involved in several of these, including the guidelines for trustworthy AI from the European Union. But so in one end, it shows that there is a lot of interest, a lot of recognition that this is an important thing to address at this moment given the potential impact of the using of AI software systems. But it's also can get quite confusing because there are too many of these guidelines. So which one do you need to use? Which one is the most appropriate for your own circumstances? It gets increasingly more complex. Fortunately, they are not really very different from each other. They are very abstract. They talk about principles at the very high level of abstraction, which makes it easier to compare, but in other hand, makes it much more complex to implement. But what we cannot forget is that all this type of documents, all this type of approaches are not just about the software, are really principles for us, for those that develop, that use, that provide, that are somehow affected or affecting the process of using and developing AI. Sorry. Yeah. So the latest of in this row of issues is the European AI Act, the regulatory proposal of the European Parliament, which appeared just a few in April, just a few months ago, which proposes really a very detailed and very very potentially addressing a lot of issues at the level of regulation, at the level of law. It's not anymore a question of choosing or selecting or deciding to join or to adhere to a set of principles. No, the idea here is that within Europe, we really will be bound by law to do things in a certain way. And what this regulation proposes is, in one end, this risk-based approach, so systems that are used in considered high level, high risk areas, or are using high risk types of technologies, will have a different and a more extensive regulations and checks and controls than the systems which have a minimum risk. It is human-centered, and it's, I really think, very important that the European Union is coming forward with this very strong position that AI use and development needs foremost to be human-centered, needs to take into account the fundamental rights, the human rights and societal principles, so that's at the center of everything. The proposal in itself, there is still a lot, there have been almost every day since then, a lot of discussions in terms of how is it setting blurry lines? What kind of definitions are there? There are potentially cases for loopholes or to find out ways to go around or to avoid it. Not only, or also because of the way that the AI has been defined in this system, in this proposal, it is so broad that it actually, if you take it exactly as it meant there, it can address any type of software. So there are quite a lot of still to be worked and decided and improved, but it's a very strong position in terms of we really want AI to be human-centered, to be used in a responsible and in a way that benefits people and society. So it's, I think, as a statement, as a political statement, putting forward this regulation is really capable of really changing the way that not only in Europe, but all over the world, all of us will start thinking and looking at the development and use of AI. But there are several alternatives or complements to this regulatory approach. There is a lot of work being done at the level of standards. Standards are more like soft governance. It's not really mandatory to follow, but organizations can show due diligence or can show that they are really standing for something by adhering or showing that they are addressing and compliant to these standards. We also see, especially in industry, increasingly development of advisory panels, ethics officers at organizations, which really are there to set and to monitor the ethical guidelines, the responsibility principles of the organization in terms of the ways that they use and develop AI, and that we see especially at the level of larger companies or multinationals. And in some cases, they go so far that these advisory panels or these ethics officers have the capability to veto or to limit the development of some of the projects or the deliverables that don't adhere to whatever guidelines they have set. We also see a lot of work done on the assessment. So how can we check that the systems that we are developing or the systems that we are procuring or using are indeed aligned with guidelines, regulations, principles for trustworthy or ethical AI. There is a lot of work there being done. And as it is, and here I think that we still need to do much more work on the issue of awareness and participation. Education and training are essential for all of us, the ones who, not only the ones who develop or who provide AI systems, but also all of us, all citizens, to understand what is AI in basic levels. What does it mean, automated decision making? How is that affecting our lives? How can we respond to that? What kind of voice do we have in order to demand from our governments, demand from organizations, the types of uses of AI that are aligned with what we find important? So there we still need to do a lot of work to really provide this voice to everybody who is being affected and which lives have been, or parts of their lives have been are increasingly being decided by automated decision-making systems. So this is basically the work that has been done at the level of legislation, the level of guidance and regulation and the setting of principles and guidelines. But there is also, of course, a lot of work done about the design of these systems. And how can we design systems? How can we really build these systems to be built in terms of to address the concerns, to address the principles, to be aligned with these ethics guidelines that are around. Like I said, if you look at those guidelines, at those principles, what the principles and the guidelines say, those values that are determined there, are increasingly abstract. So it says about you want the system or to ensure fairness or to ensure transparency or to ensure human agency or all kinds of very abstract principles, which we already as persons will probably have different interpretations of what that means. But if we are building the systems, we really need to make a transparent process of interpret and concretizing these values into norms, into requirements for the system, and then finally into the functionalities of the systems. So it's not just say what is important, fairness is important, but really describe what are ways to define fairness, and then how, depending on the context, depending on the resource, depending on the techniques, how am I going to implement this fairness? And that we want to do in a way that we can evaluate, that we can measure, and that, of course, we can implement into software. And at the same time, we want to be able to trust these so-called black boxes. If the system is around, the system that we are developing are not always able to be transparent enough, we want to be able to query these systems, to ask the system what are the options, why is it doing things in one way or another. And even more, we might want to control the systems, to determine, and that's what the work that I've been doing in my research group here, what we call the Glassbox, is a way to control what are the effects and the input, the outputs of this system into the world, and which ones of those potential outputs do we want to limit or to address specifically, because they might not be exactly what we think is aligned with the responsibility and ethical principles. We need to do that in ways that are independent of the internal design of the systems, because this black box is not just, it's not for nothing that this black box exists, not only because of issues of complexity. Sometimes it's just too complex to understand how the system works, but still we want to have some type of trust or guarantees that the system will be, that there are liability and accountability measures in place. But it's not only complexity. Sometimes the black box are there due to IP, due to business considerations, due to safety, national safety considerations. So not in all cases we can really address the inside of the black box, but independently of we can do it or not, we really need to be able to audit, to question, to determine liability for this type of systems. We also need to be able to trust that the system works in many different approaches, in many different ways, many different contexts, because we never know as we build these algorithms where and when they are going to be used. So the verifiability of the system really needs to be addressed independently of the way that it has been used. So in many different types of possible interactions with the system. And finally, we want to be able to have some type of commitment from those that developed and use and provided this type of system, this type of service, to have some type of contract commitment that if for whatever reason things go wrong, or if for whatever reason we need to get more information, more explanation about what happened, there is a commitment and potentially a legal commitment to do so and to provide that liability and that responsibility. So one problem is indeed, and I think that slides were is out of order, apologies. So one thing is indeed that the black boxes are cannot always be avoided, and we need to be able to trust and to check the compliance. But another thing is, like I say, about this difficulty of and the potential different interpretations of a specific type of value. So if we talk about fairness, we can define fairness in many different ways. We can decide that it is fair to give everybody the same resources, like in the image in the left. We can decide that it's fair to give the ones who need the most resources, or we can decide to implement fairness in a way that it's not just about the resources and the accessibility to resources, but really the accessibility to the results. So there are, these are simple cartoon-like type of approaches, but we really need to understand that fairness in this case can be identified or can be understood in many different ways. And depending on the way that we are understanding it and the way that we are implementing it into our systems, it becomes, if that's not clear, if it's not transparent, which of the different types of interpretations of fairness we are taking, becomes extremely difficult to compare or to understand exactly what these systems are doing. And if we talk about algorithmic transparency, we often are at the level of what we are doing with the resources without really being able to understand what is the context that led to that type of potential interpretation of inputs and outputs. So we really need to work much more in this contextual, in this social technical approaches to the transparency, and not just focusing on the way that the algorithms work. I think that, how long do I still have? Like 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, so this is just some more details in work that we are doing in my research group. So what we do is this Glassbox approach, in which we are, in one end, defining the methodological and evaluation methods to describe and to implement these high-level concepts in terms of requirements and functionality for systems. Then we translate that into ways or into checks into existing systems that can be done by observation of the system, so not by inspection in terms of opening the black box, but by observation of the behavior of the system. And we use this interpretation stage together with the tests that can be done to the what we are observing in the system to determine whether or not a particular system, independently of how the system is built, it's independent of the internal construction of the system, which means that it can be in principle applied to non-algorithmic systems, to organizations, to people, and so on. We just look at what we expect this system to be done according to the interpretation that we have determined, and we verify that indeed whether or not that observations are aligned with our interpretations. We want to do that in a, like I say, in a domain agnostic way, so a way that it's independent of the domain and independent of the type of technology used. Also that it's aware of the context in which the system is being used. Of course, it needs to be implementable and computationally tractable to order to be able to really do the verification and the monitoring of the system in real time and or at least in reasonable time. So basically what we do, the verification of a system becomes the equivalent to check whether a certain implication holds for all the assumptions of that system within the system does what the system does counts as fairness, for instance, in a specific context. So does count treating everybody equally count as fairness in a certain context is then the equivalent of checking that that in that context that implication is verified, and in all different assumptions, all different possible observations of the context. And the way that we are addressing it is possible to address, for instance, using approaches of answer set programming or argumentation logics. We also can look at transparency or as responsibility as a contract, which is what I already said, abstracting from the internal operation, supporting many different types of ways to, so the autonomy of building the system the way that you pretend, so separating the development of the system from its operation, and at that time impose the constraints and expectations on the system from externally observable expectations. So it doesn't matter anymore what the system itself wants to achieve, what are the values of the system, but by contract we can verify that the system can indeed do or not what is expected from it from the contractual perspective. So then we can regulate not so much what the system wants, but what the system is doing, let's say. And it requires to have some type of control or some kind of trust that indeed these contracts are meaningful and are can be observed and can be verified by, for instance, third parties. This is, in a sense, going back to the future or going back to work that has been done in AI community in terms of multi-agent organizations and agreement technologies. So it moves a bit from the current data-driven approaches to AI, but I believe that this combination of different technologies really will be able to solve or to address many of the issues that are currently connected to the over reliance on data-driven approach to AI. So finally, I would like just to finish with some issues concerning again, these requirements, these regulations, these laws, and these guidelines that are coming for AI, which very often we hear that the more regulations are there, the more issues, the more guidelines are there, the more difficult it becomes to innovate, the more difficult it becomes for organizations to be able to do whatever they want. It might be so, but the past, and there are many examples in which we really can see this type of approach, to see regulation, to see ethics as a stepping stone for innovation. And there are many within the digital world, but also outside of the digital world, there are many examples of differentiation, many examples of successes in terms of organizations that really take responsibility, that really take human values or human rights as central to their business model, and have been extremely successful. We see this, for instance, in the food industry with the current offerings of organic or fair trade or free range type of food. So it's really betting on a certain type of principle. We think that animal welfare is important, or we think that labor conditions are important, and we center our business around that. We see that also in the digital world. For instance, DuckDuckGo, the web provider, or the search engine DuckDuckGo is based on the idea that they will not track the users, they will provide privacy to the users, and they have been extremely successful. Linux or Ubuntu are based also on the idea of open source. So taking principles is definitely not a burden for innovation, but can really be taken off, can be seen as a stepping stone, and we really have to make it possible within Europe and also outside Europe that organizations can take this ethical perspective in a way that ensures public acceptance, but also that really provides a drive for transformation and a drive for better solutions and a business model that really provides the return on investment. So those are, it is all possible, and we really need to have a different mindset in which we don't see regulation as a burden, but really as a stepping stone. And finally, yes, there are quite some concerns with all the way that AI is being used at this moment. It is a lot of it coming from the fact that we are over-relying on data-driven systems, on this pattern identification, pattern matching, without taking sufficiently into account that these patterns are as good as the data that they are given to, that the systems who are identifying the patterns don't understand what these patterns are. So the issues of bias comes very often exactly from that fact, that it's not just the bias, the data, but it's also about how we are dealing with the decisions coming from these systems, and also how we are dealing about the all processes in which the systems are designed and managed. Issues of explanation, and we do need to push forward the demand for systems to be able to explain, to provide an account of what they are doing in a way that it's user-centered, that understands the context, but also that it's just in time, is clear, is concise, understandable, and so on. And finally, the issue of diversity. First, on the developing and the use of AI, and the task for the AI, the computational task force around the world is very little diverse, and a lot of the issues come exactly from this lack of diversity in gender, in background, in discipline as well. If we only rely on engineers to build the systems, we are lacking on the possibilities to really understand the impact of the systems that we can get from those in humanities and social science. So we need to have developer teams which are also diverse in terms of discipline, and also in terms of diversity of what are the motivations to use and to develop AI systems. So These are all very real concerns, are concerns that need to be addressed in many different ways, both at the social level and at the technical level, and are issues that I believe that are driving forward the need and the understanding and the realization that there is no AI if that is not responsibly developed and used. Thank you.